Future Jack here. Over the next 4 episodes, I will be interviewing 2 individuals who are involved in the conflict and violence in Northern Ireland called the Troubles. These 4 episodes will include their experiences and insights on the Troubles, as well as what justice looks like. However, these experiences are only but a small sample of what took place during the Troubles. To find out more and hear more stories about the Troubles, I recommend you check out the Troubles podcast. So, let's talk. Have you ever had a civil discussion with someone you disagreed with, or who had a different perspective than you? If you have, what did you learn? Here on the Moderate Review, we try to have these kinds of discussions. So, let's talk. On this episode of the Moderate Review, I interview Joe Campbell from Truth and Reconciliation Platform, and we talk about the origins of Northern Ireland, the start of the Troubles, and how Joe was involved. So, let's talk. Listeners note, this interview was originally recorded on July 15th, 2021. This episode contains descriptions of murder, and the names of the perpetrators have been censored to not bring notoriety to these individuals.
Well, my unpopular opinion, Jack, is that I try not to judge people who have been involved in conflict and who have committed crimes, and in a lot of cases convicted of those crimes. And I tend not to try and be judgmental because I personally do not understand, and I don't think many of us can understand, what motivates people to do the things that they do against other human beings in conflict. So from my perspective, I tend not to jump to judgments. A lot of people do. I'm not saying that makes me a better person. I'm just more inquisitive. I want to understand what motivates people to bring harm to fellow human beings in those type of situations.
If you don't mind me asking, I don't think not everybody is able or has got to that point where you are. Why is that? If you don't mind me asking, what led you to get to that point?
Well, I think from my own experience, if you take Northern Ireland as an example, you have people in situations where you had an army and and a police which were essentially representing the state. People felt oppressed and defended themselves because of that. In a lot of cases it went beyond defense, and you can't defend that. But in situations where people, were defending themselves, their families, their properties, their cultures, and hearing the stories of those people, which is what we do in our organization, you have to stop and say to yourself, well, I can understand in some situations what some of these people were doing. What would I do in that situation? So when you hear the stories of victims and survivors, it makes you stop and think, that could have been me in different circumstances. So that's essentially why I've got that view, Jack.
I don't think a lot of people know about Northern Ireland and the Troubles. And so perhaps could you give me a brief history and explanation of how Northern Ireland became Northern Ireland, and also maybe how the Troubles started?
Yes, well, Ireland was essentially owned by British for approximately 800 years. It was owned and ruled by the British. And there were significant events that happened over that time. I won't go over them all, but one of the key ones was in the 1800s, approximately between 1845 and 1852, where there was a famine in Ireland. There was a famine in a lot of places in Europe, but essentially what happened was the staple crop of the country, the potato, that crop failed. But there was plenty of food to feed people, to feed the Irish people. But the English landlords and owners at the time decided that the people weren't worthy of feeding. So, any food that there was essentially sent across to Europe and sold for profit rather than feed the local people. So what happened there was you had 1 million people who died, and approximately 2 just over 2 million people emigrated. Most of them to America, which is why we've got a massive diaspora in America. That's a stain on the UK government's history, and it's a key part of the Irish history. I mean, if I told you that the only country with less people living in it now than there was in 1850 was Ireland, many people wouldn't understand that, wouldn't believe that. So that was one of the key events in Irish UK history. But essentially, what happened was there was a rising in 1916 in Ireland. Ireland is made up of 32 counties, and the people across Ireland rose up against British rule. And they were largely, this rising was largely defeated. And there was turmoil for another 5 years. That brought us up to 1921. And in 1921, an agreement was reached. Well, it was imposed on the Irish people, but the country was partitioned. So 26 of the counties in the southern and western part of the island were partitioned, and that became known as the Republic of Ireland. It was set up as a republic. And there were 6 counties in the northeast of the country that were set up as British. And there was planters, essentially from Scotland, who were put into that part of the country to keep it British. But there were lots of, native Irish people still there who would have an aspiration for an all Ireland and for a unified country. But that's essentially what happened. So the country was partitioned in 1921. The political structures that were set up there were loyal to the UK government. And, there commenced then, it was almost 100 years of rule by the UK government in that northern part of Ireland. I think it was primarily unionist parties that ruled that part of the country. The native Irish people really didn't get a look in anything, in terms of jobs, housing. Round about 1968, there was a movement similar to what happened in the United States. There was a people's democracy movement that wanted change. People started marching on the streets of the major towns in the northern part of Ireland. And those peaceful protests were suppressed. So I think it's important to say at that point that the IRA essentially did not exist. There were some attempts, in the years since 1921 to try and reunify the country, but there was largely little support for any armed insurgents, during those years since 1921. But it's important to say that when the civil rights movement, it's essentially what was called in 1968-69, it was absent of any armed support, and rightly so. But I think what happened then was those marches were not accepted well by the unionist population in Northern Ireland, nor indeed the UK government. And soldiers were sent into Northern Ireland, and the local police force, which was identified as a Protestant police force for a Protestant country, were not particularly kind towards the nationalist population. Quite quickly over that period, things escalated into what we now know as the Troubles. That insurrection went off in different directions from round about 68 right through to when the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998.
What really changed? What really changed so that, it became like these peaceful protests, these peaceful marches to these horrific acts of violence?
They say that history is written by the victors, in this, and there was a peace agreement signed in 98, and there are going to be different versions of what happened. And I think that's one of the issues that we've got in Ireland, is that, there isn't a full independent history of what actually happened. But from my perspective, and from where I see it, what initially happened was that there was there was a campaign of violence, but that started from armed groups defending their own areas. So you had a complex situation there where you had a Catholic population, particularly in the major cities, who felt oppressed. The army had been sent in initially to keep what was said initially was to keep the peace. When you put an army into an urban situation like that, things quickly escalate out of control. And in some areas, and in most areas, the army were seen as saviors because they were protecting the Catholic population from the RUC and from the loyalists. But that quickly changed because, as that situation evolved, you then had armed groups on all sides who were trying to achieve their own aims. You had the IRA, and they were known as the IRA to start with. I mean, they did split into two different movements. You had they split into the Provisional IRA, which was the main Republican group, and the Official IRA. And they had feuds amongst themselves. But as the years went on, and as those movements grew, their aims were not then just about defending people. They went on a campaign of violence against the UK state to achieve what was their main objective, which was to try and unify the country and try and to push, as they would say, to push the British out of Ireland altogether. And then, of course, on the other side, you had the groups who would have been loyal to the UK, the unionist groups, the paramilitaries like the Ulster Defence Association, which was the main group in the early days. You had the Ulster Volunteer Force. You had the Ulster Freedom Fighters. I think it's important to say then that you also had little satellite groups of both the Republican and the loyalist groups. And even today, you still have, the satellite groups. Like as part of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, there was a deal struck, and there was a disarmament of mainly the Republican groups because many of the loyalist groups did not disarm. So you've still got lots of arms that are hidden out in parts of the country. I assume those arms are still there because they were never given up. But up until 1998, there was insurrection. The Republican groups against the UK forces and against the police and the local British Army regiment, the Ulster Defence Regiment, which were people drawn from mainly the loyalist community. And you had the loyalist groups who were, what they would say, defending their people and their areas against the IRA. But, on both sides, you had wanton violence, and people were murdered purely because of their religion. But, it wasn't religion that was the source of the Troubles. It was discrimination in terms of jobs, houses, opportunities in the country that started it.
My next question I did have, and you did talk about the kind of different organizations and groups. Could you maybe describe those groups and kind of what their main objectives were? And maybe also if you could define, some certain terms like the Unionists, Loyalists, Nationalists, and also the Republicans.
So if I start off with Republicans and Nationalists would be people who would be Irish descent and with aspirations of a united country. And that they were mainly from the Catholic population. So you had, on the other side, you had Unionists and Loyalists who were loyal to the UK government and who wanted to keep that northern part of the country under UK rule. So on the Republican side, the main groups were the Provisional IRA, the Official IRA. And as I said, over the years, the Provisional IRA grouping expanded, developed, and went on a defensive campaign against what was seen at the time as oppression of the people. They went on a proactive campaign to try and unite the country, and that just didn't involve, fighting, what was essentially a guerrilla warfare on the island of Ireland, they took that across the UK. There were many atrocities that were committed in the UK and further afield. There were even some on army bases in Germany, for example, UK army bases in Germany. So then of course you had the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, who were loyal to the UK, Ulster Volunteer Force, who were loyal to the UK, and the Ulster Freedom Fighters, who were also loyal to the UK. They also went on a proactive campaign, sectarian murder campaign, where they murdered people from the nationalist / Republican side of the fence, if you like. And they also committed atrocities across the border. There were bombings and murders committed. I think one of the most famous ones was the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, where the Ulster Volunteer Force bombed the capital city in the Republic of Ireland, and it was one of the biggest atrocities of the Troubles. So that's the two sides, if you like, and they're briefly, Jack, their main objectives.
My next question I did have, and if you don't want to talk about this, I understand if you don't. How are you involved in the Troubles? I mean, aside from living there, and what is your story?
Yeah, well, that's easy to talk about, Jack. I've talked about it many times, and I'm happy to talk about it. My father was murdered in the Troubles, and just a little bit of context to that. My father lived on the southern part of the island. He was born in Donegal, which was one of the 26 counties, and his father was, if you like, policeman in the Republic of Ireland. The police force was called An Garda Síochána. So my grandfather was a policeman. And much like, a lot of the states and, a lot of places in America, it was a man and boy type job. And my grandfather got moved to County Monaghan, which was just on the border with the north of Ireland. And my father and his brother decided one day that they wanted to join the Republic's police force. So they went into the nearest big town, which was Monaghan town, and they tried to join the police force in the Republic. And they had an embargo at the time on recruitment. So my father and his brother cycled back out to their little village, Scottstown, and they then cycled across the border to Enniskillen, which is in the northern part of the country. And they joined the police force in Northern Ireland, the Royal Ulster Constabulary. Now that was unusual, Jack, because the Royal Ulster Constabulary was largely a Protestant force, a Unionist police force, and some had said a Unionist force for Unionist people. So it was unusual, and my father would have come across many challenges, in his role as a Catholic in a predominantly Protestant Unionist police force. Anyway, my father met my mother. They had 8 children, and we got moved around a bit as policemen usually do. That was common in both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And we ended up in a little place in the northeast part of the country, in the Glens of Antrim, a little village called Cushendall. And it's just important to say as well that my father served in the RAF, post World War II for a year. So he was stationed in Egypt. So he joined the RUC in 1950. Actually, my father had no great ideological reasoning for joining the Royal Ulster Constabulary. I think it was probably just a job, maybe a steady job, have a family, settle down, be able to pay the bills. But of course, life changed, dramatically for us all in February of 1977, when my father was murdered 200 yards from our home.
Wow.
As he was closing the police station. He was 47 years of age, Jack. And the reason that he was murdered was that in the 18 months or so leading up to his murder, he had discovered that loyalist paramilitaries had been smuggling guns in on the coastline, just about a mile and a half from our village, with the support and help of other members of the RUC. And my father had highlighted the issues that he had discovered through his chain of command. And someone somewhere in that chain of command decided that my father should be murdered. And that decision wasn't taken lightly either, because, bearing in mind that my father was a Catholic, the reaction that there was going to be as a result of that decision. But, nevertheless, my father was murdered by a man called who was essentially an assassin for the security forces in the north of Ireland. And he was also, that same person was also involved in the Dublin Monaghan bombings that I mentioned earlier. In fact, it's estimated that he killed up to and over 150 people over the course of his life and his involvement in the Troubles. So essentially, he was an assassin for the UK security forces. But and I'll just jump forward. It's safe to say that today, 15th of July 2021, which is over, it's coming up to 45 years since my father was murdered. No one has been convicted of my father's murder. Despite 2 failed police investigations, an inquiry by a body called the Police Ombudsman's Office in Northern Ireland, and that was set up, Jack, to investigate some of the controversial cases that there were over that period known as the Troubles. But, they held a 12-year investigation that cost them millions of pounds, but at the end of it, they were unable to say, or they were unwilling to say, who murdered my father and why he was murdered. And that doesn't sit well, and there are hundreds and hundreds of cases like that across Northern Ireland where, there has been state involvement. The state managed, they're now managing these cases that they were actually involved in perpetrating. And as I said, that involves hundreds of cases, but there's still an awful lot of unhappiness and trauma as a result of those unresolved cases. And you think some, Jack, that we were talking about some tin pot dictatorship in another part of the world. Well, we're not. We're talking about the UK state here. And I don't know if you keep up to date with the news, but just yesterday in the House of Commons in London, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Brandon Lewis, has announced an amnesty, or a proposed amnesty. Well, that's what it is. What he's saying is that before 1998, there are going to be no convictions, no inquests. And we didn't have a proper inquest. Bearing in mind that my father was a policeman. That's quite a shocking thing to contemplate. So there's a lot of controversy here at the minute, because essentially what Lewis is trying to do, the Tory party was one of their recent commitments was that they were going to ensure that their soldiers and police officers and members of the Ulster Defence Regiment, which was a regiment of the British Army, people in those organisations who committed murder of innocent citizens in Northern Ireland are going to be given an amnesty. And they've softened that blow by also making that amnesty available to the paramilitaries, to anybody who committed any of those crimes up until 1998. So my mother's 86 years of age, Jack, and she's probably going to go to her grave. And 2 of my brothers are deceased, but my mother's going to go to her grave without knowing, without seeing any truth or justice for the murder of her husband. And I just like to include, Jack, this little bit. During the Troubles, strong women kept everything going for us all. The role that women played, mothers, sisters, aunts, daughters played. The traditional role back in those days was a woman was a homemaker, but I think not enough attention and credit is given to women just for the roles that they performed and how they got us all through, those times known as the Troubles.
This concludes this episode of the Moderate Review. Please join us next time, where I continue my discussion with Joe, where we continue to talk about his involvement in the Troubles, his views on reconciliation, and how he deals and helps others with trauma. Until next time, I'm your host, Jack Taggart. The views expressed in the Moderate Review are solely of the individuals participating, and not necessarily of the organizations they are affiliated with. If you enjoyed what you've heard, please tell your friends, and please follow us on Twitter at TModRev, that is the letter T, Mod, Rev, one word. Until next time, I'm your host, Jack Taggart. Have you ever had a civil discussion with someone you disagreed with, or who had a different perspective than you? If you have, what did you learn? Here on the Moderate Review, we try to have these kinds of discussions. So, let's talk. On this episode of the Moderate Review, I continue my discussion with Joe, and we continue to talk about his involvement in the Troubles, his views on reconciliation, and how he deals and helps others with trauma. If you haven't listened to the first episode, I strongly encourage you to do so. So, let's talk. What are your thoughts and impressions, more, I guess if you could elaborate a little bit more about how obviously your family will not see justice in the murder of your father, and as well as other people, but also, what are your, I guess, thoughts and impressions of the people who have done that terrible thing to you and your family?
I think the first thing I'd say, Jack, is that, I was 19 years of age when my father was murdered, and I was the last person to see him and talk to him. I had been in the police station making a statement about an attack on our house the week before, and my father was off duty that night. He didn't really come. He had no need to come to the police station that night, but we now know that he was lured there by one of his colleagues who phoned him, and the gang that arrived to kill him that night, if he hadn't gone to the police station, they would have come to the house where we were all in that night. It was a tremendous act of courage and bravery and compassion that my father showed that night when he basically sacrificed himself to ensure that the rest of his family were safe. And also important for me to say that I strongly commit to truth and justice for everybody who has suffered loss and trauma during the Troubles. This is not just for myself, because there are so many victims of violence and trauma and loss over that period. But, in a proper democracy, Jack, you would have to expect at the minimum that, the right to life be respected, a proper investigation under the Human Rights Act, that the UK government should be compliant towards that. I also speak for all victims and survivors, and I don't care who you are, whether you're a soldier or a policeman, you're entitled to a proper investigation, and your family are entitled to know as a minimum what happened to you. And if there's any chance of any justice, then, you should be afforded that by the state. So in terms of how I felt, well, I was an angry person, Jack, in those early days, no doubt about that. And my father was murdered in the 25th of February of 1977. I left the country in September of that year, and I moved to London, where I'm still based, sadly, but I've made a life the best I can here. But the trauma of what happened never goes away, for victims and survivors. And it's a generational thing as well. I've got children, and my children don't fully understand, what happened in Northern Ireland, but they're keen to understand what happened to their grandfather and who he was as a person. So I was very angry in the early days, and of course, immediately my father was killed, the RUC press office said, that it was likely to be carried out by a Republican terrorist group. But that of course was untrue. And they knew that at the time. And it's not to say that Royal Ulster Constabulary members, that policemen were not targets of, the Republican groups, because they were. Security forces were targets. But my father had lived in, an open and free life in our village, and our village was predominantly, a nationalist area. I wouldn't say that there wasn't extreme republicanism there. There were people who wanted to, see a united country, but were not prepared to take up arms to achieve that. And that's right, because violence, is wrong in my view to try and achieve political aim. So I was an angry person, but as the years went on, and I started to investigate it, my father's case, because of the absence of a proper police investigation, and I had discovered that, in fact, it wasn't the IRA, but it was, in fact, a loyalist group, the Ulster Volunteer Force, with the support, an organisation of some of my father's colleagues within the Royal Ulster Constabulary. So that was a big blow. I think everybody, no matter what country, no matter what situation you're involved in, I think we're all brought up to understand the difference between right and wrong, and that if something happens to you in a democracy, that you expect that the forces of law and order will come riding over the hill, and they'll make everything good. But that didn't happen. So my investigations took me to the door of the person who murdered my father. I actually doorstepped quite a number of years ago, the year that he died. What were my feelings then? And I've taken a bit of criticism from some people that I didn't try to do harm to this person. When I met him and I challenged him about the fact that he'd murdered my father. But life's not like that. I don't think we're programmed to do those sorts of things, and I certainly wasn't. My anger was replaced by a determination, really, Jack, to find out more about what had happened, and why it had happened. And I will record what said when I put it to him that he had murdered my father. And his exact words to me were, "I am convinced that I had nothing to do with that." Which is a strange thing to say. It's almost like a pre-prepared statement, but it, in itself, it gives away the fact that, if I accused you, Jack, of robbing the bank, in your neighbourhood yesterday, your natural reaction, I don't think you would say to me, "I am convinced I had nothing to do with that." You'd probably use stronger language, but you'd say something along the lines, "Get the hell out of here," or "I wasn't even there." I didn't do that. Your emotions and your language would be different. So in terms of how I felt, I've managed to get on top of the early days hatred that I have. That's not to say that what happened to me and to the other thousands and thousands of people who were the victims of, murder or trauma, certainly affected our lives in ways that we'd probably never fully understand. But I've managed to try and turn that to try and investigate it, understand. I can never accept it, and I could never forgive the people who did it. But I don't believe that you need to have forgiveness to have reconciliation. But my views have changed, and my views have also changed by talking to other people who were the victims of trauma from different groups within what was known as the conflict back then.
How did you discover the truth behind your father's murder? Like, what leads or what sources did you find that led you to it?
Initially, it was a journalist. A journalist had approached me. There was a TV company in the UK who were doing a program about the Dublin Monaghan bombings, and one of the contacts that they had spoken to, because it's important to say, Jack, that the Dublin Monaghan bombings were carried out by military intelligence, UK military intelligence. Again, that case is also unresolved. And it's also important to say at this point, for most of the major incidents in what is known as the Troubles, the UK government have slapped public interest immunity certificates on the case papers. Like, for example, a very good friend of mine who's part of our organisation, and I know we'll talk about that in a moment, Eugene Reevy, had 3 brothers murdered. 3 innocent young men just going about their business in their little farm in South Armagh in the north of Ireland were murdered by the same gang that murdered my father and committed the Dublin Monaghan bombings. And Eugene has got a civil action in the High Court against the UK government for that. But the UK government have closed the papers on that case for 70 years. 70. So that's how the UK government is approaching dealing with the legacy of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. They do not want to have scrutiny of their major involvement in a lot of these atrocities. They don't want the world to know what they were doing in Ireland. So how did I find out? So I eventually got beyond the journalist, and there's a couple of books that are worth reading, Jack, if you ever get the opportunity. One is called The Committee by an author called Sean McPhillamy. And the other one is A Great British Jihad, and that's by an author called Paul Larkin Coyle. But I managed to get to people within the gangs, so I doorstepped them. Like, there was a guy called who was a serving member of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, himself and a colleague, a fella called. They were convicted of the murder of an innocent grocer not far from my village. So I got to talk to these guys, Jack. He was able to tell me who murdered my father and why he was murdered. He was involved in that, but he, of course, denied it. But I recorded the conversations with these guys as well. So you manage to get your hands on, pieces of intelligence, case papers from other court cases, etc. So that's how I got to the point in my knowledge of what happened to my father, Jack.
Another follow-up question I do have is, you could talk about how you being able to overcome trauma that you have experienced, and I guess how were you able to overcome it, or like what were the steps that you were able to follow?
I'll tell you about my friend Stephen Travers, who's the leader of the little group that were involved in TARP. Stephen was in a show band back in the days, and his group, made up of Protestant Catholics, were stopped by the same gang that I'm talking about here. They're known as the Glenanne Gang. So if you Google that and look up, you'll understand who that group was made up of. But Stephen was very seriously injured on the night coming back from a gig, going from the north of the country into the south. And 3 of his bandmates were murdered. There were 2 Ulster Volunteer Force members who were murdered that night. Essentially what they did was they were stopped at a checkpoint. The Ulster Volunteer Force, with security force members there, were putting a bomb under the front seat of the van, which was due to go off as the van was crossing the border, and they were all going to be identified as terrorists and the border was going to be closed. That was the objective. The bomb went off prematurely. The 2 guys planting the bomb were blown to pieces. The rest of the gang then proceeded to try and slaughter the rest of the group. But Stephen survived that, thank goodness. And Stephen was told by a psychologist in the early days, try to give him sodium pentanol to try and talk about his experience, because he felt that he was just dealing with it too well. And the psychologist said to him, said, Stephen, at some time in the future, it could be 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years later, the wall will fall on you. And Stephen talks about this, when we do some public speaking in schools and other places about it, Jack. A few years ago, Stephen was asked to go to a peace centre in Coventry in the UK, where a guy called Colin Parry, whose son Tim and another person were murdered by the IRA. Who put a bomb in the town of Coventry. The bomb went off and the two young lads were murdered. And it was people who'd been affected by trauma, and they were asked to bring along, something from the night of the incident that affected them. And Stephen brought along a guitar string for one of his murdered colleagues that he'd been given to fix. So anyway, they went round the group of people, and there was a guy there, an ex-army guy, who brought along a little fire engine. And Stephen listened to this guy talk, and he was an alcoholic, drug addict. Had a terrible impact what being in the army had on his life. And he said, I always wanted to be a fireman, but I never got the opportunity. And the guy broke down, and Stephen said, I just wanted to go over there, put my arms around him, and I could help this guy. I've been able to deal with what happened to me. I can help this guy. I've got experience of this. I know this stuff. Then it became Stephen's turn to talk about what had happened to him. So he put his hand in his inside pocket to pull out the guitar string. And he took it out, and he went to speak, and the wall fell on him. 40 years later. He couldn't speak. He didn't know where he was. And I think if you talk to anyone who's experienced trauma, my wall fell on me just 5-6 months ago when we were doing a podcast with other people who've experienced violence in Northern Ireland and trauma, and listening to their stories, and it just hit me. And I looked at this person talking to me, and I said, I convinced myself, Jack, you see, that I could also cope with this without any professional help. Didn't realise the impact it had had on all parts of my life. And I looked at that person and I said, that's me. I saw myself as a survivor and not a victim, but the reality is I'm both. So I've sought help, professional help, that's been able to let me understand what happened to me and my family and others, victims and survivors, but my own personal journey. It's let me understand what happened to me, but also to be able to resolve some of those issues and to control what happened to me and use that for good rather than letting it control me.
Could you maybe describe a little bit more of how you've been able to not let it control you?
What I tend to do is I tend to use if you like, the people who are close to me, my father. Because when you talk about, you probably know about some incidents in the Troubles, like, the Dublin Monaghan bombings, Bloody Sunday. There are other incidents like that. The Troubles is peppered with labels. But what it doesn't do, Jack, is talk about the people who were involved and affected, the people who were murdered, the people who were seriously hurt. I use the qualities that my father had for good. Like my father was committed to doing the job that he did. He was compassionate. He was courageous because he joined a police force that was probably alien to everything that he ever was brought up to believe in. He was a kind man, and there have been so many anecdotal stories that people have shared with me from the different areas that my father had worked in. So I use his qualities, and I use the qualities of my mother. When I think of my mother at 41 years of age with no breadwinner in the house, 8 children, how she ever got out of bed in the morning, never mind trying to get 4 or 5 rugrats out to school and try and cope with her own thoughts and her own trauma and her own demons and do all the practical things that she needed to do. So I use that in my own experience of understanding how I came to the point where I needed to seek help. And I use that when I talk to other people to try and show people that violence does not work in terms of achieving political aims. The trauma is generational, so people need support and help. That, no side has got a monopoly on suffering, and that we can all, with my experiences, that I can make a contribution to try and ensure that we don't repeat the cycle of violence that there seemed to be in Ireland for 800 years.
As we're kind of winding down this interview, I do have a few more questions. So I guess looking back after everything what has taken place, the agreements that have been signed, what do you think maybe the government could have done differently to maybe better handle the troubles and more of making sure, and possibly even making sure that it didn't get to the point where it did?
Well, I think if the Unionist state and the UK government had been generous to the nationalist people in the north of Ireland, it would have been a different place. Properly share power, in terms of political institutions, opportunities for jobs, and not hold it against an individual's religion against them in terms of looking for a house and a job. Encouraging the cultural aspects of who people are and what they believe in, in terms of their music, their songs, their art, their drama, their games, and that could have been done. That was easy to do. But I think they've compounded those errors that were made, since 1921, Jack, when the country was partitioned. Because when the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998, and it was signed between the two countries, the Republic of Ireland and the UK, it was sponsored by the USA and the EU, they ignored victims' issues. Essentially what the Good Friday Agreement was an end to violence, an end to killing. But what they didn't do then was set up a process, a truth, reconciliation, a justice process that dealt with those issues. So those issues are still around today and still causing as much controversy today as they did in 1998. So over the period up to the Troubles and during it, they could have been more compassionate, could have been kinder. They could have sat down and made people feel welcome. You could have accommodated both traditions, but they didn't do that. And I think they compounded that then in 1998 when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. And, for example, remembrance, symbols, flags, marches, that was all just left for people to get on with it. And there's controversy around all of those issues every single year, every single day in Northern Ireland. There's a commemoration of some description. And if you don't do that respectfully, and if you use your commemoration as a symbol of hate, to hate someone from the other side, then you make no progress whatsoever. So you need to have, in my view, you need to have the truth. You need to have a proper truth process. We know that the government, what they've done with regards to closing some of these cases for 70 years, that they're not honest about that. They're not committed to that, and that's wrong. So you're never ever going to get those issues resolved. But you need to have that truth. People need to understand what happened. If you can understand what happened, you don't have to agree with it, but with the understanding, you can understand where somebody else was coming from, what their point of view was, what happened to them. There can be an empathy there on a human level. And I think when you have that empathy, that understanding, that truth, you can then have some respect that allows you to go forward together to make it a better place and to ensure we don't repeat the cycle.
Where are these groups now? And I guess maybe to an extension, where are you at now?
Oh, I'll tell you about me. I'm in a good place, Jack. I have, made a conscious decision to lead the best, full, positive life that I can do. I want to roll back some of the work that I do. And it's work in my own head, really. I can still do some practical things with the organisation that I'm involved in. There are still a couple of extreme groups who want to ferment the trouble and the violence. Like, you've still got a couple of extreme Republican groups. They're small in number. But the truth is that, Jack, these groups are riddled with informers who work for the UK state. And to me, that's one of the key things in all of this, is that the government are saying that they don't want to have these expensive investigations and inquiries. They don't need them. They have got all of the information that they need to give people the truth. So it's a false equivalence. It's a white elephant in the room. On the loyalist side, the fact that the UK have left the EU has caused some issues, because the southern part of Ireland is in the EU. The northern part is still part of the UK. There was a border up until 1998, and in 1998, there was part of the agreement was that citizens in the north of Ireland could be UK and Irish. Therefore, we didn't need a border anymore. But because because the UK have left the EU and Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland is still part of the UK, there had to be a border for goods and services, because there's different tariffs, different protocols in place. So there's a border down the sea, and that has caused some issues from the Unionist loyalist people, because they see their connection to the UK being diluted. They believe that the border should be on the island, but if you put a border in the island, then that creates major issues for the Good Friday Agreement. So I'm in a good place. Some of the groups are still around. The UK government can turn it on and off as they wish, Jack, and that should not be the case. It should be left to the people of Ireland, all the people of Ireland, to work out a better way forward with proper support from UK, EU, and the USA, who are all the brokers in this.
My last question I have is, could you tell me more about TARP, and if anybody wanted to reach out to you or maybe TARP or maybe other organizations, where would they go to find it or find out more?
Very simple answer. tarp.ie is our website. The three main people in the organization are Stephen Travers, who was a victim of the Miami Show Band massacre. And if you haven't, Jack, you can get Netflix made a documentary about that. Mm-hmm. So the Miami Show Band massacre, if you go online, watch that. It's very enlightening. Eugene Reevy, whose three brothers were murdered, and myself. And essentially what we do is we get some funding from the Department of Foreign Affairs in the Irish government. And essentially what we do, Jack, is we're a storytelling group. We give people who've been affected by the Troubles, who've had someone murdered, who've suffered trauma themselves. We give them an opportunity in an apolitical environment. We've all got our own views about the world, about Ireland, and how things could and should be done. But we give an open space for people just to tell the story about what happened to them and their families. And in doing that, people from both sides, and from all sides actually, because it's not just people from the Unionist and the nationalist populations. There are people further afield, people in the UK who were affected by violence. But we give them an opportunity just to tell their story, because we feel that's a powerful message, Jack. We believe in truth, and the best people to tell the truth are the victims. Our key objectives are that we want to avoid a reoccurrence. We do that by understanding exactly what happened to individuals. We show empathy to each other. We show that no side has got a monopoly on suffering. We all suffered. Violence is wrong, as a means to achieve political aims, and we just want to try and avoid a reoccurrence. So tarp.ie is our website. You can go on there, you can listen to some of the testimonies, you can see who we are, you can see what we do. And anybody who has got any questions, who wants any support or wants some more understanding, they're very welcome to contact us.
This concludes this episode of The Moderate Review. Please join us next time, where I interview Colin Ferguson, a British soldier who served 2 tours in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Until next time, I'm your host, Jack Taggart. The views expressed in the Moderate Review are solely of the individuals participating, and not necessarily of the organizations they are affiliated with. If you enjoyed what you've heard, please tell your friends, and please follow us on Twitter at TModRev, that is the letter T, Mod, Rev, one word. Until next time, I'm your host, Jack Taggart.